Good morning. My name is Garrett Smith. So I'm going to be talking about something that's kind of weird at a software conference, diversity. Actually, it isn't that weird. It's kind of popular these days, but it's not that kind of diversity. So in school, I'm used to this, back in university, I'm used to this being like social engineering diversity, like getting people into a room that look different or think differently. And back when I was in school, I was kind of this crazy American conservative type, the kind that you read about and you're just like, wow, that guy's crazy. I was kind of like that. And I thought, diversity for the sake of diversity is actually kind of this touchy-feely thing, and it made me uncomfortable. I like this engineer type that says, if there's not some specific merit to something, don't give it credit. And this topic of diversity is out there floating as like, is diversity for diversity's sake valuable? So that's the question. And I think most people would say, yes, it is. There's strong arguments to be made, but that's sort of in the context of social, I would say engineering, but our data life, our daily life with other people. Diversity is important. But what I'm going to be talking about is diversity for the sake of software and diversity in general. I used to think that this is too touchy, this is sort of touchy-feely. Today I've changed my mind. And I've changed my mind. You'll see sort of the thread through this presentation of what is driving my thinking. But here's a fact. That's a fact. Diversity drives our existence. So all complex life on Earth, so we're talking about biology here, nature, all complex life on Earth is predicated on diversity. And I'll get into the specifics of that. But without diversity, without the generation of options and diversity for diversity's sake, we don't exist. This conversation is not happening. That to me is a very strong argument in favor of diversity. We don't have to debate this anymore. And for me, the question isn't so much the value of diversity, but how can we harness diversity? And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so here's another fact. 99.9% of all complex life, so complex life, eukaryotic, multicellular organisms, that's you and me. Dogs, cats, worms, most things that we're used to dealing with, that we can see, reproduces sexually. All right, now sex is a controversial topic at conferences these days. Let me be very clear about what I'm talking about here, in case you're thinking I might be violating some code of conduct. I'm talking about biology, the stuff that you study in school. It's legitimate. I can do that. It's fine. So I'm going to use the word sexual reproduction here, and not sex, but you can use the word sex. That's technically accurate. But this is interesting. Let me just kind of quickly go through what this means. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, the core of this is this process of meiosis. Meiosis is the generation of a very specific type of cell. It's a gamete. It's a sex cell. In men, they're sperms, and in women, they're eggs. And these things come together, these two cells come together, and they're designed to be able to come together, to fuse to create a new cell. And the creation of these is a very specific process, and it's a very interesting process in nature. And I want to talk about that, because it's going to highlight a particular point that is important. Okay, so what happens here? This is biology, if you don't like biology. It's interesting, though. It's very interesting. Okay, so we start out with two chromosomes. Each of our cells, we have two chromosomes, one from our ma, one from our pa. That's the way we're built. So we start out with that, and these chromosomes are replicated. They're just copied, right? Our bodies do that. Our cells do that. They're good at copying things. So now we have two sets of these chromosomes, and the second phase here is what we call a crossover phase. This is the interesting part from my point of view, and for the point of view of this discussion. This crossover phase is basically a shuffling of the genetic code on the chromosomes. So you get some of your ma's DNA genetic code goes over to pa and vice versa. And so you have this new set of chromosomes over here, which are basically random reshuffling. That random reshuffling is really important in this process of diversity creation, which leads to all complex life. Very interesting, this shuffling process here. And we'll see how this is a problem in a second. Okay, so this one cell actually converts into four, because each one of these then becomes a sex cell, a gamete. And this is what's unique about these. They only have one chromosome. And so when they, find one another through pollination or insemination or whatever technique these species uses, they fuse together to create essentially a unique organism that has a combination of the genetic code from Ma and Pa. That's sex, pretty much, without the gory details. Actually, that is the gory detail. So what is this thing? This thing is what scientists call the queen of problems. We don't know why sex is so essential to the generation of complex life. Science today, over 100 years after Darwin, doesn't really understand why this process exists, and why it's so central to the creation of what we know today as, pretty much life on Earth. So it's referred to as the queen of problems, and it's driven primarily by the problem of cost. So you don't have to reproduce sexually. You can reproduce asexually. You can clone. Cells clone. And you take the same exact genetic code, and you can make a copy of it. And you can get genetic diversity through natural mutation. So that's typically how you would interject variation into a genome. It would be through natural mutation. Mutation can occur through all sorts of different ways. But you don't need this gene shuffling. You don't need meiosis in order to reproduce. So why is it? So the cost of sex is having these two different things having to be created and then find each other. Right, so finding a mate, cost of sex. The risk of sex, sexually transmitted diseases, etc., which are prolific through nature, cost of sex. Here's another cost of sex. Careful here. Let me explain here. The cost of sex is really taking a specimen that is known to work very, very well and erasing it from the universe. And I'm going to give you an example here of Michael Jordan. I'm from Chicago. Michael Jordan's from Chicago. I grew up watching Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan is definitively the best basketball player that ever lived. We agree, right? We're all in agreement on that, of course. Easily. So if you're a basketball engineer, what you do is you say, I'm going to create the world's greatest basketball team. What you do is you clone Michael Jordan. You put 5 Michael Jordans on the basketball court and you play that team. Here's what you don't do. You don't take his kids and put them on the basketball team. Now, these are Michael Jordan's children. I'm not saying they're terrible people. They're great people. I don't know them personally. I assume they're great people. I'm just saying they're not great basketball players. If you were to put them against Michael Jordan, 3-on-3, like 3 clones of Michael Jordan would crush these people. His kids don't have a shot at all of success in basketball. Why? Sex. You took this great basketball player, this combination of genetic code, and you erased it. And as an engineer, I'm looking at that going, if I did that with my code, every time I got something to pass, something to compile or a test to pass or felt good about something, and then I just randomly reshuffled it, how effective would I be as an engineer? Not that effective. It'd be kind of crazy. I would not be working in this industry very long if I did that. But yet nature does do that. And somehow that process results in this conversation, our existence. So that's kind of a mystery. And so, scientists are quite perplexed as to why this randomization results in, or is so central to and important to, really, really complex, effective engineering. So I'm not going to get into this. Unfortunately, there's no good answer. Why sex? There's 20 mainstream theories trying to explain why sex is so predominant in our natural order. None of them is accepted in general. None of them are free of problems. There's lots of controversy, and there's no answer in sight. It's just a process that biologists are working through. We do know, though, that at the heart of this, the driving force is diversity. Diversity driving adaptation. That much we know. So that is a strong data point to say that in nature, at least, diversity is central, a driving force to innovation, to the creation of excellent solutions to problems. And that's what we do as software engineers. So what I want to do is take a look at this general topic of biology. How do you apply biology to the things that we do as software engineers, as programmers? So to me, this is an interesting shift away from the traditional model of architecture, physical architecture as the model for software. So how people have read at some point the idea that when we build software, it's similar to building a house with a foundation, with plans. This is traditional kind of waterfall. This goes back. Most of us don't do this, but still in literature today, there's still a big notion that we're building structure. I don't think that's accurate. I actually think what we're doing is building alien life form. We're building new organisms. And what builds new organisms? Biology, nature. So what I want to do is look at some specific processes, methods, patterns in biology and see if they can inform my thinking as a programmer. I think it's reasonable. I think our existence today and the fact that we're having this complex exchange right now, me speaking, you listening, our brains, the most complex, known complex entity in the universe was created through this process. Maybe we can learn something from that. So, now that's the general high-level concept. You should feel uncomfortable when anyone talks about stuff that's too high level. So what I want to do is bring this way down into a specific methodology. But it's a methodology that is based in processes of evolution. All right, so to do that, I'm going to appeal to this guy, Paul Valéry. So he was an essayist. He's not a biologist. He's an essayist, a philosopher, but very scientific and mathematical and very much tied into sort of the thought patterns of the day, early 20th century. And he has a quote here which I think is very interesting. He's talking about invention in this case. So this is the process that we participate in when we build software. We invent things. So here's a philosopher talking about the process of invention. And he says this: it takes two to invent anything. The one makes up combinations. Combinations meaning options, things to choose from. So we're talking about diversity. Diversity results in things to choose from. So the one makes up combinations. The other chooses, recognizes what he wishes and what is important to him. Right, so let me go back. There's two parts. First part is you generate options. So combinations of things. The second is you choose, recognizing what you wish and what's important. And then he goes on to say this. Genius, and this is the stuff that we're used to, being genius architects. Genius is this. It's the readiness of the second one, that is the chooser, to grasp the value of what has been laid before him and choose it. That's genius. So it's an interesting observation that I find remarkably similar to this. This is natural selection. This is Darwin's finches, 4 of them. And the idea is, of course, in nature that we generate, or nature generates, options through various mechanisms. Sexual scrambling of genetic code being one driver of diversity here. But in any case, we have diversity. We have things to choose from. And in nature chooses through natural selection. So it isn't an actual entity in space and the universe selecting, seeing you. It's simply one of these beaks is more suitable and more fit for a particular application. And that particular beak design tends to proliferate and tends to succeed given a set of requirements. And so that's natural selection. So what Paul Valéry is talking about here is effectively an evolutionary process. So let's give him some credit here. I'm going to describe the Valéry software method. So this is a method that you and I can use to build software. So we're going from super high level crazy diversity talk to how do we actually build software? I like concrete things. Okay, can you guess how many steps? There are 2 steps. 2 steps, ready? Number 1, generate options. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, let's say that you want to store some binary blob someplace and you're a networked application. Let's just do an exercise here. You can store it locally on disk. You can put it in S3 or some cloud store. You can store it in your local SQL database. You don't have to do it at all. That's an option. Maybe we don't want to store it. So what I'm going to do in this case is, this hypothetical case, is just generate options, just brainstorm. I'm not going to have an emotional genius, big brain appeal. I'm just going to mechanically generate options. And here's the second one. You ready? It's complicated. You select the best option. It's a very simple process of mechanically enumerating a diverse, broad set of options, and then applying your genius. your wisdom, your knowledge of how things work and don't work. You can apply this as an individual, so you can do this sort of internally. So to say here's step 1 and then here's step 2. Or you can do it in a group. This is a very collaborative process as well. So it's very simple. You might say, well, this is frankly not even a methodology. Actually, it is a methodology. I use this all the time, and it does take discipline. There's an instinct that we have to just sort of jump into a solution immediately. It's like, we're very, very quick. We're smart folk, and humans have the ability to envision solutions that don't exist. We're unique in this respect as organisms. We can forecast the future, and we can see things that don't exist. So there's a temptation as architects or designers or programmers to just kind of jump into a solution. This method says, no, you don't do that. You stop and mechanically enumerate the possibilities. Don't invest emotion in this. This is a pure generation of diversity. It's random shuffling almost. Not pure random, right? Because we can sort of harness the power of our brain to hone in on sensible options here, but it is very much mechanical. So that's the method. Do you buy it? Is this going to revolutionize software? I think it does. I actually think it does. So let me take this a step further because there's a little bit more that we can talk about here. And it comes into this topic of generating option. I want to look at biology here to help me, or nature to help me, sort of give me some boundaries, help me to think about the set of options and how I generate them. So let's take a look at how does nature do that. Well, in evolution, it's predicated on a stable basis, a stable environment, a context of replication. Right? None of this happens without something to iterate from. Evolution it is not random, it is not an explosion in a print shop. Right? It is stable, and it is incremental. So generating options should recognize your context, so you should understand your technical environment, the languages that you're working with, the databases that you're working with, and understand what you have today, your expertise, the people's expertise in the room. You recognize that. That becomes your starting point. You derive from that then incrementally and fine-grained. That's evolution. This is evolution. And this is not violated. This is something that is not controversial. This is the way evolution works. It is classic Darwinian. It is incremental and very fine-grained. And so there's a temptation in software to make jumps. Sort of these big sort of acts of the creator. I'm going to create this thing. Nature would tell us, don't do that. Make it incremental, very, very fine-grained. And so I want to appeal here to a biologist in this case, Ronald Fisher, attributed by some to be the greatest biologist since Darwin. So he has a mental model to help explain the value of small incremental change. And it starts with a microscope. So you start with a microscope and you have a specimen under the microscope on a slide. And the specimen in question here is in focus for the most part, but not quite in focus. It's not perfectly in focus. And what we want to do is we want to improve the focus. And here's the exercise. We're going to adjust the focal length of the microscope up or down at random. We're going to pick one. We don't know if it's up or down, but we're going to pick one of those. And we have two options here. We can make the smallest possible change that's available up or down. So we're going to make a change that we can perceive, but it's going to be the smallest possible change that we can perceive, up or down. So that's option 1. Option 2 is we're going to make a large change. We're going to go, one of the two. So one of the two. So let's compare that. Let's do the math. And this is Fisher's mental exercise to help us understand this. So here are the chances of improvement. The smallest possible change, right, gives us a 50-50 chance. Because we're almost in focus, we're not quite there, we're not perfect, and we're going to make the smallest possible change. We know that one of those two is going to make it better. It has to. So that's 50%. And you might be saying, well, 50% odds of improvement is not very good, and my manager's not going to be happy with that. Well, let's look at the alternative. The large is close to 0. So you make a large change to something in this particular case, you have almost a 0% chance of improving the focus. So let's do the comparison here. A small, very incremental change is roughly infinitely better than a large change. Now, if this was anyone else, you might think, well, this is an overly trivialized example. You're taking a microscope, you have a single axis here. This is Ron Fisher, though. You need to respect this. What he's doing is he's he's making sort of an intuitive, sensible argument to explain what happens in nature. This isn't controversial. This is fact. We exist today through this process. This is actually true. It's why changes that we observe in evolution are incremental and very, very small. So what do we do in our software? It's very simple. We never, ever, ever make large changes. That's a radical change from the way most of us work. Now we think, well, agile, we've got two-week sprints, et cetera. What I'm talking about is really, really small changes. So you start with your code base and you say, what do I need to do to improve this? And even a feature can be changed incrementally. Let's take a look at how that could work. So this idea of design, in this case, designers, architects, the big brains in the room, actually that goes away. So we don't have design anymore, we have evolution. This is a big change to the way, certainly I have historically done software, but I'm adopting this. Revolution tends to be what we're talking about in software. We as software engineers want to revolutionize. We want to take these big steps. That's why we do things. None of us want to do small things. We want to do big things. Sorry, it's still evolution. Right. Example, revolution in nature, winged flight. Right? Revolution, you go from crawling on the ground now to flying in space, flying in air. Right? Whether you have a wing as a bird or as an insect, right? Or as humans, it is a complete revolution and transformation of nature. How did that happen? How is it possible to have a revolution in nature? It starts with this little guy. Do you disagree? The weight of science is against you. Here's how it works. I mean, as remarkable as it is, and if you look at these inventions here, if you look at this, the way that that's structured, it's unbelievable how complex and how sophisticated this invention is. This is an invention of nature, but no one invented it. Invention of nature, unbelievably complex. The power source used to drive this thing, unbelievably complex. All right, we're getting there. We're getting there, slowly but surely. But it did start from this thing. And what is this thing? Well, this thing is a guy who's probably trying to get food. He's probably trying to get an insect, or maybe he's fleeing from somebody, and he starts to leap. And gradually, one variant of this guy starts to get a little, wing, a little, flap of skin, and he can jump a little bit further. And he jumps a little bit further and gets a little bit more food, or gets to escape from the predator. And of course, that little genetic code gets replicated, and the next variation, the next iteration, the next choice of diversity gets selected, and eventually, it does take a while, eventually you do get to winged flight. And actually you do have flying lizards. So what else can evolution tell us about what we do? Right, so we talked about diversity, the value of diversity. We talked about a simple method of enumerating options, so it's driven by diversity. Making a selection, that's the genius. The nature of our changes, the changes being incremental rather than large. Making the point that you can have revolution, breakthroughs in your technology by making small changes. It's a fact. It simply is a fact. You don't have to question it. This is the power of falling back on nature. You can just win arguments. You can just say, nature, I win. Done. It's a proven, what I'm saying here is it's a proven process. Right? We don't have to speculate as to whether or not this actually works. It's really a matter of how can we take the mechanics of this process and apply it, the mental models, how to approach things and apply it to our work as programmers. That's the question. So an example of that is optimization. We say code optimization, making things go faster. We say don't do premature optimization, right? Get your software to work before you optimize it. Well, nature doesn't care about optimization at all. There is no concept. There's no moral imperative to go a certain speed in nature. There's only this idea of fitness. And fitness has to do essentially with survivability. So is something suitable for the task? So if you buy into this whole idea of letting biology inform your thinking about your software, you can actually drop the word optimization from your lexicon. Joe Armstrong, creator of Erlang, says, there's no such thing as fast, only fast enough. It doesn't have to be fast, it just has to be fast enough. That's a statement about fitness or suitability. Human eye. Not very good underwater. Pretty good here. I have glasses, but pretty good out of water, not very good underwater. Very good, this is a fish eye, very good underwater. It's suitable, it's fit for underwater observation. It's an eye of an owl. Very, very good at night, very, very good to find little moving creatures. Nature's done a really very, very good job of equipping creatures with suitable or fit vision. So we don't need to look at our software and our designs and say arbitrarily it must be thus. We can allow the natural environment, its ecosystem, evolutionary pressure to define what it is that it needs to be. This is a very liberating concept, in my opinion, when it comes to doing something. Because you don't have to do anything. You say, what's driving change here? What do we need to change? What is driving our requirements? Then we adapt to that. And we do so with this small evolutionary incremental change. So this is the topic of software as biology. So what are we talking about here? How does nature invent something? It does invent things. Do you disagree? It's all over the place. It's the most fantastic series of experiments and inventions we'll ever see. We're here observing it. It's fantastic. So how does that happen? Understand how that happens. Understand how this is perpetuated. It's happening, but what is the system here? What maintains this? How can we sort of implement some of these patterns in what we do? And so specifically our mental models, our memes, our patterns, we can use terms in our conversations with one another. We can define methodologies that respect these types of patterns, these processes, because we know that they work. So finally, to wrap up here, on this topic of diversity, we need diversity to generate options. So you cannot have good, at least as far as biology is concerned, you cannot have good design without something to pick. So we generate options. So this idea of diversity, multiple languages, multiple technical platforms, you could call them species. You've got the Linux species, you've got the Windows, you've got OS 10, FreeBSD, these are sort of species, and they have interbreeding properties, etc. Languages, very similar, you have language ecosystems. But having diversity within your technical environment is essential. It's not just an option, because it drives adaptability. Adaptability is the driver of survivability. So just being viable as a programmer, if you know one language, you should know a second. You really should know a second language. Go pick up just find one. Doesn't matter. Be like nature, just pick at random. Don't get caught up, don't overthink something. Just make it small and incremental. And generate options for yourself, and then apply your genius and select an option just to see how this works. Okay, so this is, what is this? Is this experimental? Yes. I don't know, this is not a mainstream movement in software, like going out, using biology in this way. I think it should be. I think this is really effective. I've been using these types of techniques for a couple years now, and I won't go back. I'm not gonna go back to over-designing something, with diagrams and boxes and everything else here. I like to start with an existing system and iterate. And you find that the products and the technology that you design change in quality. They become more adaptable. They become more evolutionary in their approach. You tend to have lots of small things rather than one large monolith. It just happens. It's just the way it works. So I would encourage you to, what are some hard action items here? Learn some different languages, inject some diversity into your environment, pick up some books on evolution or biology to understand how some of these concepts work, and send me an email if you find anything that's interesting, because there's not a lot of people talking about this, and I think it's really important for what we're doing as programmers. So with that, we have time, I think, for probably one question, maybe two. Does anyone have a question? Yeah. I'll repeat it, so go ahead.
So if your language sounds promising and interesting, my question is about starting with an existing system and then progressing in making it better.
Yes.
What if you're stuck in the global maximum?
Yeah, exactly. So the question is, if sounds great for greenfield, and everything is great for greenfield. The greenfield is great. So what happens if you have some existing, big monolithic software that you have to evolve? Well, I would say two things. Number one, you might be dealing with a dinosaur. You might be dealing with something that is eventually going to go extinct and really can't evolve. There's some software that just can't evolve. It didn't start out as evolutionary, and it just gets stuck. So it's a local, as you say, a local maximum. You look to bring out, pull out functionality and build new small things. So you service orient. You can replace functionality not by modifying that system, but by adding new things and then communicating. So message passing. You start to build a system rather than looking to modify that existing sort of monolith that's hard to modify. One more question. Yeah.
My concern is time. For nature, it takes thousands of generations to get from jumping lizard to a bird.
Yes.
And we don't have that much time. Our business, our market demands us to make.
Yes. Our burn rate will not give us 3.5 billion years to experiment with our so-called evolution. So we're not being blind here. We're not being random. So nature is truly being random here, and the experiment is absolutely fantastic in its scope, in parallelism and time. So we obviously don't have that type of time. This, when directed precisely with smart people, is the most efficient path to building the right solution for a problem. It's the small change. Remember that the microscope model? Where if you make a big change, the problem is that the fundamental problem here is that when you make big changes, you're being speculative. And chances are you're going to miss your mark. If you're small and incremental, and I mean really small and incremental, you can change. You can recover from a mistake very, very quickly, and you will meander your way through to an optimal fitness for a particular problem faster than any methodology that I have seen. Now, I haven't done this for that long. That's the premise. It does not take 3.5 billion years to ship your software using this methodology. All right, with that, I have to finish. Thank you very much.